Senator from Texas.
Madam President, as the Senate's schedule for this calendar year begins to wind down, hopefully in anticipation of our spending time with our friends and families during this holiday season, I'm going to look back over some of the deadlines that the Majority Leader, the Senator from New York, has set for Senate action, and to ask whether these sort of arbitrary deadlines and attempts to do legislation essentially along party lines is the right way to actually get things done in the Senate. We have excellent examples of how to get things done. Today we passed the Defense Authorization Bill with a strong bipartisan vote. But we know that when either political party decides to do things unilaterally, with that, especially in a 50-50 Senate, it makes the work immeasurably harder, and that's for a good reason. The founders of this country and our Constitution and the creators of this Senate looked to the Senate to be a deliberative body and looked for us to do what sometimes doesn't come naturally, which is to work together to build consensus. But as I said, when one party or the other attempts to do things unilaterally, it usually means what you see here, which is one blown, self-imposed deadline after another. First of all, the Majority Leader set a July 21st target for Senate action on a budget resolution. He laid out an August deadline for a partisan election takeover bill, which would have preempted state and local laws, which are responsible under our division of responsibility in the Constitution under our federal system for conducting elections. And then he proudly announced his goal to get 2 bills to the President Biden's desk by the end of October. And he said those would be joined together. A bipartisan infrastructure bill that is the exception to the rule, actually like the Defense Authorization Bill, that actually enjoyed broad bipartisan support. But the hang-up was the other part of that proposition, which was the Democrats' multi-trillion-dollar partisan spending bill. Of course, not one single one of these deadlines was met. Again, because it's hard to do things in a 50-50 Senate when you try to do it unilaterally without doing the hard work of building consensus, which is the way the founders wanted this institution to work. So our colleague from New York keeps setting deadlines and blowing right past them, and it looks like he's about to add another one to the list. Senator Schumer's latest deadline for the Build Back Bankrupt bill is December the 25th. That's Christmas. And while he has yet to make an official announcement, news reports are starting to confirm what we've known all along, that the Senate will not vote on this bill by Christmas because it's just not ready for prime time. Before our colleagues can bend the rules of the Senate to pass their partisan multi-trillion spending bill, they've got a lot of roadblocks to overcome. The most obvious is they need a bill to vote on. This bill is not even in final form yet. As a matter of fact, the Senate Finance Committee, on which I have the pleasure of serving, released about 1,100 pages of new text on Saturday. And there's at least 20 different issues that have been raised with the parliamentarian, which need to be litigated in a deliberative process. But the version of the legislation that passed the House started getting picked apart even before reaching this side of the Capitol. The committee chairmen here were still deciding which provisions to keep, which ones to alter, and which ones to throw away. It's tough to know how things are progressing because all of these conversations happen not here on the Senate floor with open debate, but behind closed doors, completely out of view of the American people. That's dangerous because this bill will touch virtually every aspect of Americans' daily lives. and stick them with a massive invoice without any visibility into the process. We're told that the Build Back Better bill is immensely popular. Well, that may be true until you start looking at the details, at the fine print. But right now, we have to rely on vague statements from our Democratic colleagues to understand where things stand, and I'll tell you, right now it doesn't sound too promising. Following severe blowback from the American people after the details of this bill began to become public, Finance Committee Democrats began making changes to one extremely controversial part of the bill. The Washington Post headline says it all. The second biggest program in Democrats' spending plan gives billions of dollars to the rich. No wonder they went back to the drawing board. After all, there's a sharp contrast from how our colleagues have tried to sell this bill, really in an effort of false advertising. They've harped previously, or in some sections of the Democratic caucus, on the need to stick it to the rich, to tax the rich. But when given the opportunity, they hand out massive tax breaks for the rich. It's unclear how long it will take our colleagues to finalize changes to the millionaire's tax break and countless other provisions that are being retooled. But once they lay down their pens, the work is not done. As I suggested, they have the substantial and difficult process of vetting a number of the provisions with the Senate parliamentarian to determine whether these provisions can pass the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule is simply the name given to the process to see whether it complies with the 1974 Budget Act, which provides for an expedited process and 51 votes for passage because it is limited strictly to budgetary matters. When our colleagues try to stick into the bill other substantive law changes which require a 60-vote requirement, that's where the Byrd Rule comes in, and that's where these provisions get kicked out. According to the chairman of the Finance Committee, the Finance Committee proposal alone has more than 20 different issues to resolve with the parliamentarian in the so-called Byrd bath. And that's just one committee. Our colleagues on various other committees are presenting arguments on provisions of all sizes. We've heard that our Democratic colleagues are trying to make massive changes in our immigration law with a party line vote at 51 votes, 50 votes plus the vice president. Well, that has not succeeded on two previous occasions for good reason, and now we are awaiting the verdict of the parliamentarian on those immigration proposals on the third try. But we know that this massive legislation, once it's written, presumably, will go from everything from technical changes to major issues, like whether the budget rule can be used to legalize millions of undocumented immigrants. Again, these conversations are happening not out here in the Senate with an opportunity for full debate and amendment. They're happening behind closed doors. So we really don't have a good sense, nor does the American people, a good sense of what's been decided or how long it will take to resolve pending disputes. And if our Democratic colleagues receive adverse guidance from the parliamentarian, it's still unclear whether they will accept the outcome or light the rule book on fire, as some have suggested, and try to overrule her. It's tough to imagine a world in which our Democrat colleagues would put this Frankenstein's monster on the Senate floor before Christmas. Christmas is, in fact, 10 days away. Even if our colleagues were able to iron out every issue with the parliamentarian, were able to present finalized text and receive a score on the final legislation at that time, Senator Schumer doesn't have the votes to pass it. Again, we're an evenly divided Senate with the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote. But colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not on board entirely with this proposed massive spending and tax bill. Unlike the majority of our colleagues who have blindly fallen in line or aired their concerns in private, we know that Senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, has consistently expressed his reservations about the bill. In September, for example, he wrote an op-ed titled, "Why I Won't Support Spending Another $3.5 trillion." He's hardly been quiet or hidden his concerns. He shared his concerns in that op-ed about the scale and scope of this legislation, and he encouraged his colleagues in his own political party to take a strategic pause. Some of the reasons he cited included the growing threat of inflation, which has only increased since September. Inflation, in fact, has now reached a 40-year high just last month. He warned about the possibility that the virus might mutate and take a new turn, and we ought to really save our powder in case we had to address either the public health or economic consequences flowing from a new variant. Well, today, all of our eyes are on the Omicron variant, and we have yet to know how that will play out. He asked how we could respond to another financial crisis like we experienced in 2008 during the Great Recession, or, heaven forbid, a terrorist attack or major international conflict. If we spend trillions of dollars on unnecessary programs today, we'll hardly have those reserves available to us should we need them. I think the questions and issues raised by the senator from West Virginia were valid then, and they're even more pressing now. Over the last several months, the winds haven't shifted in favor of this massive tax and spending bill. In fact, we now have more reasons to believe this legislation would add to, not solve, the problems that the American people are facing. The senator from West Virginia told one of our Republican colleagues that the score proposed by his own political party, $1.75 trillion, he said that score is full of gimmicks, and even acknowledged that that price tag is a form of deceptive advertising. We now have an honest score, one that acknowledges that massive programs cannot be started and stopped on a dime. And if you're really going to be honest about the cost of the bill, you need to look at a score that spans the full 10-year budget window. We now have that score, one that avoids the gimmicks that are meant to disguise the true cost of the bill. And now we can now quantify how disingenuous this so-called $1.75 trillion price tag really is. And it's about as disingenuous as the president's claim that the bill costs zero. Nobody believes that. It really undermines the president's credibility when he says something like that. The Congressional Budget Office now says this legislation, if in place for a full 10 years, would cost $4.9 trillion. That's on top of the almost $2 trillion our colleagues spent unilaterally earlier in this year. Well, that's certainly higher than the $3.5 trillion red line that Senator Manchin drew earlier this year. And it's a whole lot more than the $1.75 trillion price tag that our Democratic colleagues are claiming. And it makes the repeated claim that this bill costs zero seem even more bizarre and out of touch. Under this bill, as it's shaping up, we know deficits would increase by a staggering $3 trillion over the next decade. Now, last year, when we passed COVID-19 relief bills with huge bipartisan majorities, we did so because it was a public health emergency and an economic emergency, and we did it together. But on top of all that necessary spending, our colleagues are insisting on spending another $4.9 trillion, adding another $3 trillion to the debt over the next decade. Our children and grandchildren would never have a chance to dig out of the hole that our Democratic colleagues are now drilling. This legislation doesn't just fall short of solving problems, it actually makes them worse. This bill would fuel the red-hot inflation that's already burning up the paychecks of the American people. People who are on fixed income are finding their purchasing power shrinking by the day because of the threat of inflation. We know this bill would also hurt our energy security. It would give massive tax breaks to the wealthy while increasing taxes on the middle class. It would literally cut funding for safety net hospitals and drive the national debt to unimaginable heights. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it would hand to the federal government decisions that should be made by families. I hope our colleague from West Virginia will continue to hold strong against the dangers of this bill. At minimum, we need to tap the brakes and take what he called a strategic pause. And so it seems that the Democratic leader is on track to miss yet another deadline. For the country's sake, I hope this bill does not arrive after Christmas. I hope it never comes at all. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
Consent that